All right, good morning. So we're up to Ois Yud Aleph, section 11 in this essay from the Rebbe, this monumental essay from the Rebbe on the discussion of our obligation on the night of the Seder to relive and re-experience the Exodus. So that's page 44 on the left, which says Yud Aleph. So where did we leave off? We left off with the following.
Demonstration, you don't have to have it written.
In the text of the Haggadah itself, that's right, in the text of the Haggadah, we don't need to include a description of every obligation we have that night. We don't read in our Haggadah the description that you have to have the 4 cups of wine. You just drink the 4 cups of wine. So the Haggadah itself does not have to have the description. One is obligated to demonstrate how his freedom. The Haggadah does include our praise of Hashem for the wonders of the Exodus. And as part of that, we describe how incredible the Exodus is. It's so incredible that it's experienced till today. Every year, in every generation, every day. And therefore, the Haggadah says that a person is obligated to see himself, to experience the Exodus from Egypt. The fact that I'm also obligated to demonstrate is written in the Code of Jewish Law, and it's obvious from the way I'm acting tonight. I've been leaning, I set my table beautifully, all the rest of the stuff I've been doing to demonstrate that freedom. But I don't need to verbalize that in my recitation of the Haggadah. And thus, the Mishnah will say a person is obligated to see himself, because the Mishnah is giving us the text of the Haggadah. And the Rambam and Alter Rebbe's Code of Jewish Law will say you are obligated to demonstrate yourself. Where'd they get that from? Or where does that law come from? It comes from the general theme of tonight. The general theme of tonight, as opposed to every day of the year when I'm also supposed to relive Egypt and supposed to remember Egypt, on the night of the Seder, there's this stress of communicating that to another. Thus, my feelings of freedom is to be expressed. This is where we are so far. Now, I think Yeshua, and therefore demonstrate, yeah. I think Yeshua, you mentioned this, and this is what we have to cover today, which is at the end of the day, all of this comes from the Mishnah. And the Mishnah doesn't say to demonstrate. And that's the question we're going to be stuck with now. So you have this idea. The verse says you're supposed to tell to another. And you're extrapolating it from that everything is to be communicated. Well, that extrapolation doesn't seem to be in the Mishnah. So why you, Rambam, Alter Rebbe, making that extrapolation? Because Torah says to communicate the story to another. Therefore, everything else I do has to be communicated also to another. And my feelings of freedom also have to be communicated to another or demonstrated to another. That leap isn't made in the Mishnah. So why are you making that leap, Rambam and Alter Rebbe? This is what we have to address at present. So this is where we are on the left, where it says Yud Aleph, on 44. The following is still not clear. Hare Mokar Hadin, at the end of the day, the source for this law, that Shebachol Davidor Chayav Adam, etc., in every generation a person is supposed to, etc., see yourself, demonstrate whatever, that law about the necessity of reliving Egypt on whatever degree, Huma Mishnah, comes from our Mishnah that we've been learning. And because the language of the Mishnah, this is the variant of the text as it appears in Rambam and as it appears in Alter Rebbe. Not in their book of Halacha, but in the way they write the Mishnah out in the Haggadah. And in Rambam's commentary to the Mishnah, the variant of the text reads, Chayav Adam Lirois. A person is supposed to see himself. And therefore, where did the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe get this idea? Mehashas, from the Gemara. That there's an obligation also to demonstrate. From the verses, I understand how you got it. Because the verse says you're supposed to speak to another, and therefore I'm extrapolating from there that everything is to be communicated to another, even my feelings of freedom. But the Gemara didn't make that leap. So where in the Gemara did you get that leap? Rambam and Alter Rebbe can't do that. They can't skip the Gemara and say I'm learning the verse in a manner that the Gemara and the Mishnah didn't learn the verse. Cannot do that. So where in the Gemara is it also expressed that this idea of my feelings of freedom is to be demonstrated? So let's see. Habir Bezed, the explanation is.
Right. I mean, sorry.
Yeah.
It's true. I mean, you have to go tomorrow to see if perhaps maybe that's where Rambam
That's right.
already got their
Or somewhere in the Gemara that
extrapolation.
that's right. Somewhere in the Gemara that indicates that they also understood the verse which says to demonstrate, to speak to another, to not just mean tell the story to another, but actually to demonstrate your freedom to another. All right?
Yeah, we've like you said, we've already went over that
From the verses,
extrapolation from the verses.
but we have to find out in the Gemara, correct? So let's see. So I don't think we learned this Gemara yet, but it's the Gemara right after the Mishnah. The Gemara Sham, the Gemara there says, right after our Mishnah. I don't remember if we learned that part of the Gemara. Before we get back to the Gemara, I have to look back to see where we left off, but I don't think we learned it. I think we stopped at the end of the Mishnah. But the next Gemara gives a list of things where different sages in the post-Mishnaic era talk about various different things to be added to the text of the Haggadah. You should say this, you should say that. You also have to cover this. The Gemara talks about different things that are to be covered in the text of the Haggadah.
I don't think we would.
We didn't go through there. So there the Gemara says, Amar Rava, Rava says, Sarach Sheyomar, a person must include in his text of the Haggadah, Vaitzanu Haitzim Misham, the verse which reads, and from there you took us out. That verse that Rambam quoted. So now he says the Al Rebbe, L'chora seemingly, Ma Moisif Bazal Al Mirasa. What is being added by Rava in telling us to say this verse, and us you took out from there? Shiva Mishnah, L'chol Davidor Liris Etz Atzmei Kil Yotzim Mitzrayim. The text of the Mishnah, which is being transplanted into the Haggadah, already states that you're supposed to see yourself as if you left Egypt. So what's being added by Rava saying, oh, say that verse which says, and you took us out of there. The message that we feel we're taken out of there is already expressed in the Mishnah. Maybe not by this verse, but the content is already being expressed. So what's Rava adding by telling us to look at that, to cite that verse in our Haggadah? We should say this verse, and us you took out of there. Explain to Rebbe. Habir Bezet, explanation. Haloshin va'isanu loshin rabba. This language of the verse which says, and us, you took out of there. Us in the plural. Moira indicates, shebe'eis amirasai, at the time of his speaking, yesh oid mishu, someone else is present at the Seder. The Mishnah says every person is supposed to see himself as if he left Egypt. You're talking about himself in the singular, maybe he's sitting alone. But Rabbi says, there's a verse which talks in the plural. There's a verse which says, and us you took out of there. Say that verse, indicating that it's not just me at the Seder table, but others. The Zoh, and this is what Rava means when he says, and this is what the Rava means when it says, quote that verse which says, and us you took out of there, meaning talk in the plural, not just in the singular. Not just God took me out, which is what the Haggadah says, which is what the Haggadah from the Mishnah says, but Rav is adding, hey, put a plural in there also. Put us, you took out of there, that verse. Now, what does that do? Rashbam, the classic commentary on the Gemara, which we've been learning many times, says, what does it mean? Rav is telling you, say in your Haggadah, and us you took out of there, meaning the feeling that you left Egypt should be expressed in a we, not just in an I, indicating that it has to be demonstrated to the other person with you.
And this is the Rebbe's.
The Rebbe's interpretation of that Gemara, explaining. No, Rashbam says clearly. You have lahares.
He makes that.
Rashbam says right out. You have to demonstrate yourself as if you went out of there. Rashbam is interpreting this verse as it's quoted in the Gemara. And then this would be a source of Rambam and Alter Rebbe.
That's what I was going to just ask you. Is that perhaps the source?
This is what the Rebbe is saying. This is what the Rebbe is saying. This is the Gemara source. And the fact that the Gemara tells us to add a plural verse means that the Gemara is telling you, when you feel that I left Egypt, it's not only I left Egypt as the Mishnah says it, but make it into a we, meaning you're including others in that feeling of you left Egypt. And thus it must be demonstrated. As it continues. We'll move on, and it's understood. This law that Rava says that you ought to say this verse which says, and us you took out of it in the plural, is not just a detail in telling the story to your child. Because telling the story to your child is also true when you speak in the singular. You tell your child, God took me out of there. So the fact that you're saying we means we're going beyond just I telling you.
It's through the whole Seder night.
Because even if you say I was taken out of there in the singular, you're still talking to one other person and you're still speaking in the first tense singular. And therefore, when the Mishnah says, hey, speak in the plural, it means it's beyond just telling someone else what happened to me.
It's not superfluous.
It's not a superfluous statement to say us.
It has its own
It has its own message. In addition to speaking to another and saying, this happened to me, which is what's derived from the verse, you shall tell your son, there's something more than that. There's an us element. And from here, the Rambam and Alter Rebbe derive the obligation to demonstrate. And that this obligation extends to the entire night. So that way you can truly say us. Because we're all night sharing in this experience of our freedom in the plural. You can only say the our if everybody is communicating to each other their feelings of freedom. If only I am expressing my feeling of freedom, then I say I to you.
You don't know what I'm doing. You don't know.
But if we're all demonstrating, then we all know what we're doing.
You have to be in sync.
And that's what we have to demonstrate. We can only say we if we're all demonstrating to each other. We're communicating it. So we can say we all experienced our exodus from there because we are all demonstrating to each other our freedom from there. Yeah.
But it's not really all we. Most were left behind.
All of whom are sitting around the table is all part of the we.
Yeah.
If you're here at the Seder table, you're part of that we,
That's
right?
interesting because you're not allowed to leave the Seder group. We learned when they used to do the Korban. Once you were registered.
That's correct. If you're part of that, that's right. You really have to become a we. Yes, good point.
What is it? What's not halachically?
That's correct. That's very good point. The Pesach Seder required that the Seder attendees become a unit of a we.
Yeah, they're registered.
That all share together in this experience. And thus, the Rebbe, the Rambam and Alter Rebbe derive this notion that we should demonstrate to each other, and that way we can declare, in addition to just saying it happened to me, singular, and I'm speaking to you, but include a we, in which we're all demonstrating to each other that we're all part of this freedom together. Okay, Yud Beis. Bottom right to page 45. Habir Bezeh, the explanation in this fact, I'm trying to get, here. Habir Bezeh, the explanation of the fact, Sharambam Vadmor Zachen, that the Rambam and Alter Rebbe Koisvim, they write, Shachiyovhu, that the obligation is, Ki'ilu Yotzer Rak Mishibud Mitzrayim. They add the word shibud. See yourself or demonstrate yourself as if you left the servitude of Egypt. Even though the language in the Mishnah is, and indeed that's how it appears in the Haggadah, both in Rambam and Alter Rebbe, is Yatzar Mitzrayim. See yourself as if you left Egypt. Rambam and Alter Rebbe in their book of Halacha add, see yourself or demonstrate yourself as if you left the servitude of Egypt, adding this word servitude.
But they left out Egypt entirely.
Rambam left the word out Egypt when he repeated himself and said, which we'll get to soon, when he repeated himself and said, of this the verse says, remember you were a slave, doesn't add the word Egypt, whereas Alter Rebbe does add the word Egypt. But in the first statement where it said, in every generation, every person is obligated to demonstrate himself as if he left the servitude of Egypt. That word servitude, mishibud, is added in Rambam and Alter Rebbe and does not appear in the Mishnah / Haggadah. Why? Explains the Rebbe. Because the Mishnah's intention. The Mishnah's intention in telling us that in every generation a person is obligated to see himself as if he left Egypt. He is, as the Rambam and Alter Rebbe explain it, he's supposed to see himself as if right now he left Egypt. Not he left Egypt a couple of years ago, which is also pretty amazing. Not to see my grandparents as if they left Egypt, but to see as if I left Egypt, but I left 10 years ago. No. You got to see yourself as if you left Egypt tonight, now. Hainu, this means, in the parentheses. 1 minute prior to me making this declaration, I was in Egypt in my head. But and only now I left. That's the obligation. So it's impossible to say that the intention of I see myself as if I left Egypt, to say that I left now from the geographic place called Egypt. Obviously, it's not the intention of the Mishnah. Kizeu hepech Hamuchash, it's opposite to my experience. I'm sitting in Canada. So the Mishnah says, see yourself as if you left Egypt. Well, I can make an imagination in my head and say, 10 years ago I was in Egypt and I left. But if I'm told, right now, see yourself as if you left Egypt, what, I'm supposed to see myself as if the minute ago I was sitting in geographic Egypt? No, obviously not. So what's the meaning then? The servitude is the main point. That's why I'm going to add that word. It's not the geography of Egypt. It's the idea of Egypt, which is servitude. And therefore they add an explanation. Rambam will add that word in explanation. So he explains. We're actually commanded not to move back to Egypt, even though in history people have moved to Egypt, including Rambam himself lived in Egypt because they had nowhere else to live. But and therefore they were compelled to violate this command, and Rambam would acknowledge that in his letters. Under duress, it's like I had no choice, I have nowhere else to live but Egypt. But there's a mitzvah in theory, there's a prohibition against moving back to Egypt. So we command the Shalach Mitzrayim not to go back to Egypt. So as far as this commandment goes, not to move back to Egypt, ain't shaykh, it's not possible. And certainly not an obligation. That I should imagine myself a minute ago sitting in Egypt, which Torah says not to do. Torah itself wouldn't tell you to imagine yourself in a geographic location where it itself tells you not to live. Therefore, we must say that the Mishnah's intention when it says to see yourself as if you left Egypt, is to see yourself leaving the bondage of Egypt. That you can do. It's the concept, not the geography. And that's what Rambam and Alter add by putting this word in servitude. Okay. Now we have to get to, in a few more minutes we have,
like the servitude in Egypt.
No, from the servitude. But that's something you can imagine. You can imagine that a minute ago I was enslaved. And the kind of slavery that existed in Egypt, let's just say that, which we'll get to in a minute because that's where Rambam and Alter Rebbe differ. Right? Remember you were a slave, whereas Alter Rebbe adds, remember you were a slave in Egypt. Right? But the idea of imagining that a minute ago I was in servitude is something I can do. On a literal level, I can see myself that way, and certainly on a spiritual level, as we explained in the past. And a minute ago I was a slave to my urges, and now I'm not.
Saying that this jurisdiction, we're not free to practice
this morning.
Yeah.
Okay, Yud Gimel. Now we have to get to, now that we understand where Rambam and Alter Rebbe are coming from vis-a-vis their differences from the Mishnah, now we have to look at some of the differences between Rambam and Alter Rebbe, between the two of them, which we discussed prior. The reason for the differences mentioned above in chapters 4 and 5, between that language of the Alter Rebbe in his code, Lashon HaRambam, to the language of Rambam in his code, and three differences in the language. Everybody's going to recap it for us. Aleph number 1, HaRambam maybe a pasuk v'yitzanu hotzi. To prove that a person is supposed to demonstrate himself as if he left Egypt, Rambam quoted the verse that Rava said, which was, and us he took out of there. Whereas Alter Rebbe brings the pasuk as it appears in the Mishnah, which says, because of this that God did to me. Right? Rambam and Alter Rebbe brought two different verses to prove that you're supposed to demonstrate yourself as if you left Egypt. Number 1. Number 2, Rambam kosev eved stam. Rambam writes, remember you were a slave. Point. Admor Azakin Moisev, Mitzrayim Eved. Remember you were a slave in Egypt. Point. That's difference 2. Difference 3. Rambam Koisev, remember you were a slave and that you went out to freedom and were redeemed. But Admor Azakin Koisev, the Alter Rebbe switches the order. First, V'niftis, you were redeemed, and then V'yotzas L'cheres, then you went out of Egypt. Went there to freedom. So, number 1, which verse do you quote to prove that you're supposed to demonstrate yourself as if you left Egypt? Number 2, do you stress remember you were a slave or remember you were a slave in Egypt? Number 3, is it go out of freedom and redeem or redeem and then go out to freedom? 3 differences between Rambam and Alter Rebbe. So explains the Rebbe. Yesh Leimar, we might suggest, says the Rebbe, Kishinuyim Elu, these difference, Haim, top of page 46, Behesem Lachiluk Shabbadeim Begirsa Mishnah. It coincides with the differences in their variant text of the Mishnah. We mentioned this before in previous classes, that considering that printing is a relatively recent invention, And for generations and years and centuries, we relied on manuscripts, which means one person had to copy by hand and by eyes, looking and writing down the words. And with time, you have slight variations to the text. And it's a whole field of scholarship to try to find these manuscripts in the various different libraries that are available. And today, thank God, these things are digital, so you can find most of the stuff online at the National Library in Israel or the Oxford Library in England, and many other such libraries where they collect these. The Rebbe's Library in New York, too, collects this kind of manuscripts, and scholars go through them and try to find variant text. So now we're going to look at what's the difference in the text of the Mishnah as Rambam had it versus how Alter Rebbe had it.
We don't really know.
Well, we can know because, number one, Rambam wrote a commentary to the Mishnah. So let's look at the Mishnah as it appears in his commentary. Rambam also wrote a Haggadah, which transplants the Mishnah into the Haggadah. So we know what text he had there. Alter Rebbe also wrote a Haggadah. So look at the way the text of the Mishnah appears in the Haggadah of the Alter Rebbe. And in this way we can see which text they had. But you're right, very often that itself is a whole scholarship. When you're looking at a commentary and say, one second, which text of the Gemara did this commentary have? That itself is a whole school of scholarship. One of the first pioneers of the scholarship actually is Rashi. Rashi in his commentary to the Gemara will often say, I found a variant of the text that has it a little differently, and therefore the meaning is X. Or the variant that's here, the meaning would be X, but I found the variant of the text otherwise, and if that's the case, the meaning would be Y. Rashi is from the first to do this. In his day, before printing, way before printing, collecting manuscripts and then writing manuscripts to explain those manuscripts, which themselves have very different texts and whatnot. That's a whole school of scholarship in itself. Okay, so let's see. What's the difference in text between Alter Rebbe and Rambam and how that would explain these differences? Let's begin that at least. Lefi Girs, first paragraph from top of 46. Lefi Girs Rambam, following the variant of the text as it appears in Rambam. The Mishnah brings no proof text for the statement, in every generation you shall see yourself as if you left Egypt. Rambam's text did not have a proof text. Mahakosov, from the verse, which exists in our Mishnah, Asa Hashem li b'tzeis Mitzrayim, God did to me when I left Egypt. That verse does not appear in Rambam's Mishnah. V'yesh leimar timeline, and we might suggest the reason, ki yesh leimar, because it might suggest, because the pasuk which says, on that day when your child asks you, what are you doing? You should tell your child, because of this that God did to me. Who is that verse talking to? Literally, which people is it talking to? Who's speaking here? Moshe tells the people, on that day, your child are going to ask you, what are you doing? And you say to them, because of this that God did to me. Who is it talking to? It's not a trick question. He's talking to the people who left Egypt. So when it says, and this that happened to me, is it talking to me, Levi New in Canada? Maybe in the extrapolated halachic sense, not in the literal text of the scripture. The literal text of scripture is Moshe talking to the people who actually left. So they can say it happened to me. So maybe that's why Rambam says, you know what, I'm not going to quote that verse. Because that verse is talking to people who actually experienced it.
It's limiting.
It's very limiting. And I want to, it's right, and I want to broaden this halacha to everybody in all generations. Okay, the Mishnah took it and broadened it to all the generations to come. But in Rambam's version of the text, where it doesn't quote that verse, why should he take that verse, which on the most literal level is talking to people who actually walked out of Egypt, and use that as a proof text for Levi Nu telling his kid that happened to me? When the verse isn't talking to Levi Nu, the verse is talking to the guys who actually left Egypt. That's what it says here. Yerushalayim Mar Taima, we could say the reason why Rambam forgoes this pasuk which says, and this happened to me. Because we can suggest the verse is on the most basic literal interpretation. Was spoken to the people who actually left Egypt. Which is why Rambam quotes the verse which says, and us you took out of there. Because in that verse, which says, and us you took out of there, it's explicit. And we quote this rest of the verse in the Haggadah. This is what the verse says. And us you took out of there in order to bring us and give us the land.
Kind of like what Rabbi was saying.
Yes, but listen to these verses. Listen to the verse. And us you took out of there in order to bring us out, in order to take us and give us the land of Egypt. Give us the land of Israel. Who is the us that got the land of Israel?
Post generations.
Next generation, most people who went to Israel were not around when they came out of Egypt. So if they got to say an us you took out, so Levi can also say us you took out. That's why Rambam quotes that first. That never continues. The vast majority of those who entered the land of Israel were not the same people of Egypt. It was their kids or grandkids.
Sure.
And therefore, says Rambam, my Mishnah has no verse that tells me to see myself as if I left Egypt. So if I want to find a verse, which verse am I going to find? Not the verse that's talking to the people who actually left Egypt. That's limiting to those people who it actually happened to. I'm going to find a verse which talks about a generation post-generation. A verse which says, and us who took out of there to give us the land. And we, who got the land, were never in Egypt. Not physically. And yet we still say, and you took out. Indicating, even if you weren't physically there, you can still say we took us out. Thus, Rambam quotes that verse rather than the verse, because of this that happened to me.
That's what the Mishnah says.
In Rambam's version, it's not there.
No, not.
But our Mishnah says it. That's what I'm about to say. Amnam Lefi Gersa said more Zakim Mishnah, but in Rambam, Alter Rebbe's version of the Mishnah, which is our version of the Mishnah, which says Shenemar Vegad Kilbencha, where the Mishnah actually explicitly quotes a verse which says, "You shall tell your child in that day because it happened to me." Before Mishnah Shegam Kosev Os Hashem Li Yisrael B'Chol Davadar. So therefore, the Mishnah clearly is understanding the verse which says, "And tell your child this happened to me," as also a meaning for all generations. And therefore, Alter Rebbe brings that verse in his code, because for him, the Mishnah actually does learn that verse to mean all generations. Whereas because Rambam doesn't have that verse in his Mishnah, and he's going to choose any, he's going to find one that is more explicit in speaking for generations to come. Okay, we still have to explain, which we'll get to tomorrow, but why did the Mishnah take that verse?
And what did they do?
Rambam's logic seems so sound.
Pre-Rambam?
Well, pre-Rambam, they may have had more than...
Did you have to demonstrate?
What was the halacha?
Yeah.
Presumably the halacha would have been demonstration, and Rambam is deriving that. The question is how it got there.
Maybe not demonstration throughout the entire...
People were leaning. People were drinking 4 cups of wine. The question is if they felt the necessity to expand that to beyond those points and just demonstrate freedom as a general rule for the night. I imagine people did. Like the cigarette case, yeah. But leaning to the left with having a cigarette. But I imagine that would be the case, though.
Because it seems like Rambam was really
the codifier, not the inventor, right? So it must have existed as a law. He's codifying it. The question is,
if the Mishnah is giving a limiting statement that you can't extrapolate out demonstration.
Well, maybe from the word us, and the fact that Rava said, and you have to say the words, right? From Rava's. Yeah. But we still need to address is Rambam's logic of quoting the verse, which says explicitly talking about a generation that wasn't in Egypt, seems to be a better verse to quote than quote a verse that's talking about the actual generation that left Egypt. So why would the Mishnah, at least as we have it, and Alter Rebbe have it, choose that verse? And that we'll have to get to, because we're going to see in a minute.
Unless Rava's statement was well after the Mishnah.
Rava's statement is well after the Mishnah. The question is why the Mishnah, at least as we have it, and Alter Rebbe has it, says the verse which says, because of this that happened to me, which on the most basic level of that verse is speaking to the people who actually left Egypt, as opposed to the generations that followed. So the question becomes why the Mishnah chose that verse. So we're going to see soon, tomorrow, God willing, that there's a subtle halachic distinction based on which verse you quote, whether you say us or whether you say the me verse. And that might explain why the Mishnah does that. So we'll have to see tomorrow. We're going to see there's a subtle distinction, right? Because when you say me, it's much more personal. And it means actually you have to actually feel it that way.
Wouldn't establish the demonstration part.
No, that doesn't establish the demonstration. That comes from Rava about us.
Yeah.
But the feelings of I left Egypt is much more pronounced when you quote a verse, because this is what God did to me, rather than saying us in the general sense.
If it says to me, then he's only speaking about those who actually left.
On the basic text, meaning of the text. But the halacha
can expand it.
And the Mishnah does. Right? But why expand it? Why expand the verse which is why expand the verse that seems on the basic level being limiting rather than quoting a verse that begin with is open? Well, because that verse which is limiting on the basic level but is expanded has a deeper message of how you're supposed to feel as if you left Egypt. When you say it happened to me, it's much more personal than when you say it happened to us. The meaning like this: when you say a story that happened to our family, and you say this is the story of my family, do you mean that it happened to you?
It's different. It's
Maybe
different.
not. But when you say it's happened to me,
Means you were
so
there.
that's right. So the Mishnah
You
will
were
quote the
there.
verse which
You
says
were
me because it makes a stronger personal experience, even though it has to extrapolate from a generation that was actually there to us. But there's still the highlight didn't have more personal. So we'll see that tomorrow.
To do that.
Sorry?
Rava was able to.
With a different verse.
Oh, it was a different verse.
Rava quoted the verse that says us, he took out of there. The same verse that Rambam took out.
But that's how he ties it in the Mishnah. Though.
Correct. So combining the two, that's when you have, exactly, that's what we're going to see tomorrow. Which will explain why the Mishnah took that verse rather than the other verse. Okay, tomorrow, good morning.
Rabbi Levi, thank you very much.
Thank you for
It's
joining,
good
Judge,
to-
and thank
it's
you for
good-
your beautiful
it's
comment
good to-
yesterday. Much appreciated.
It's good to walk out of Egypt with all of you.
Yes,
Okay,
exactly. So
okay.
there's a tension here of making it personal, but at the same time, not being selfish in your experience. Understanding it's a shared experience. There's a dance to be had here. It's the same thing as
Thank
like
God.
davening in shul. You daven in shul, you have to daven. You're talking to God. At the same time, what you're talking to God and excluding everybody else, you're talking with everybody else. So there's a tension of retaining your individual experience while at the same time not doing it in such a way where you're so locked into yourself and not sharing it with others. And there's a little bit of a tension here in these verses, which we'll see more tomorrow.
Repetition.
Beautiful. Thank you so much,
That's right. So
Rabbi.
you have the Salat Amida, which is personal, and the repetition, which is collective. That's right. So we're going to see a little bit of that tension more, God willing, tomorrow. Okay, have a good day.
God bless you all. Have a wonderful day.
Good day.
Have a good
God
day.
bless you all. Thank you.
Must have been very